Now that we've created our Angular application, let's just take a brief little tour through the code of an Angular application of a basic one, just to kind of get an idea of the various parts that are created. We won't look too deeply yet, but we just kind of want to see what each piece does and just kind of look at the basic pieces that exist. So I'm going to open up this project here in Visual Studio Code. I've got a little way to open up Visual Studio Code very easily. However, you want to open up some kind of an editor so that you can look through the pieces that are created. So we're going to be looking over here on the left-hand side in our Explorer window. And you can see the very first folder there is that E2E folder. We're not going to dig into that at all. That's simply the folder that's created by default for end-to-end tests. By default, Angular uses Protractor for end-to-end tests. There's plenty of other products, and you can use them with Angular if you don't want to use Protractor. But the default is it installs Protractor. That second folder is the Node Modules folder. That's where all of our NPM packages get installed. The next one is the source folder. We'll look at that in just a minute. That's where all the source goes, but let's just continue on. Editor config and gitignore. Gitignore is about Git. You may or may not have noticed this, but when I created the Angular project, it actually sets up Git for me and creates a Git repository. If I were to go to the terminal and do git status, it will tell me that I'm on a branch. It actually created a little Git repository for me when I created the project. The angular.json file is next. That one is actually quite a big, important, and complex file. We won't go inside and look at it yet. It's a big JSON file with a lot of different specifications, but it's kind of the core configuration file for an Angular project. Browser list is a list of browsers that's used in kind of an advanced way in Angular. The defaults are fine, so we don't go in there really and mess with it. But if you're doing some advanced stuff with how you're going to be deploying an application, you can look and configure the browser list. Karma.conf.js is a configuration file for the default unit test runner, which is Karma. Again, Angular works with other unit test runners such as Jest, but the default it uses is Karma. Then we got our package.lock.json and package.json file, which have to do with NPM. In the last video, I invited you to check out the package.json file and look around in it. If you're familiar with the package.json file itself, it just specifies all the packages that are involved in running the Angular project that are going to be installed through NPM. The README file is just a README file, not very important. Then we get into our tsconfig files. The tsconfig.json is the important one here. That's the TypeScript configuration. The other files are also used in TypeScript configuration. And then the last file is the tslint. That's for doing TypeScript linting and configuring that. Now let's dig into the source directory really quick. This has a few parts. The app directory is going to be the main directory we're going to be dealing with and living inside of. That's where all the application code lives and resides. The assets directory is where we put static assets, things like images and stuff like that. The environments directory contains files for configuring various environments, and that matters when you start going to production and taking your project to production and wanting to configure things differently based on which environment you're in. There's a favicon file. You can change that if you want. Mostly, we won't need to ever touch the index.html. The default one is fine. Next is the main.ts file. This is actually the bootstrapping file for Angular. But again, we rarely ever touch this file, so we really won't be looking at that in this course. There's the polyfills TypeScript file that contains polyfills for the browser. And then styles.css, this file we will sometimes work with because that contains our global styles. But we can always create other CSS files and reference those as well in our project. Finally, test.ts, that's used by Karma when it's running tests and not important for us to deal with. Inside of the app directory, here's where we finally encounter some Angular files that we might actually deal with. App routing is the file where we configure our routing. We'll get to that later on in the course. The app component.css file is the styles for our main top-level component. You can see there's 4 files there, app.component.something. Those are the files for our top-level component. We'll learn more about components later on in the course. Of those 4 files, we have the CSS file, the HTML file. Those should make some sense to you. There's a spec file. That's the test file. We won't be dealing with that. But the app.component.ts file, that is the actual code for the main component for our project. We will sometimes deal with that a little bit, but oftentimes you don't do too much. It's mostly about creating new components, and most of the code that we will end up writing will be inside of those new components. Finally, the final file is our app module file. We'll look at modules a little bit later on to understand what those are. But a module is kind of a container that groups up components and other pieces of an Angular application together. And those are the various pieces of an Angular starter application. We're going to be looking at various pieces later on in the course, but I just wanted you to kind of understand the parts that are installed by default and the purpose of each of them.